This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Professor Jessica Hooten Wilson, and we're going to talk about some of her writing and research on literature and totalitarianism. So we discuss Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, some of the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Julia Alvarez's novel In the Time of Butterflies, which is about life under the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. We also discuss Victor Frankl, Josef Pieper, Michael O'Brien, Tocqueville's idea of soft despotism, and more. So Professor Jessica Hooten Wilson is the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas. She is the author of Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor and the Brothers Karamazov, which received a 2018 Christianity Today Book of the Year Award in Culture and Arts. She has 2 books on Walker Percy. She is the co-editor of Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West, and I interviewed her co-author Dave Devil on this podcast. She has a number of books coming out, and I'll put links to those in the show notes and links to her website. She's also received numerous fellowships, grants, awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship to the Czech Republic, NEH grant to study Dante in Florence in 2014, and many other awards. So thank you to all of you who've written reviews of the podcast. It really does help grow. I really appreciate it. So if you like the podcast and you have not yet given it a rating or written a review, please go over to Apple Podcasts where you can do that. Thanks again to those of you who have supported me on Patreon. I really appreciate your generosity. It does help pay for the costs of this podcast, so I'm grateful to that. And finally, I have one piece of news. I've written a little booklet. I'm almost finished. It'll be coming out very, very soon, called Digital Pandemic. And it's on 10 steps that we can take to help protect ourselves from cancel culture, from surveillance capitalism, and just from privacy and intrusion into our daily lives. So the first of those is make sure you do not use free email. Pay for your email. But if you go over to themoralimagination.com or michaelmathesonmiller.com and you sign up, I'll send out updates about how to get that book very soon. So again, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Jessica Hooten Wilson on literature and totalitarianism. Thank you, Jessica, for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
I'm looking forward to it.
You've been teaching recently courses on totalitarianism and literature. How did you get into that? Why do you think that's important? And I mean, I do too. I think it's really important, but I would like to hear why you think it's so important and why you think we need to read this literature written under totalitarianism.
Sure. So one of the things I noticed is in our culture, we are convinced that reading is kind of an unimportant activity, or it's one that we do only for entertainment and pleasure, but not one in which these books form us, shape us, tell us how to live our lives, show us what it means to live a good life. And all of that has somehow been lost. And I started wondering, when did it get lost when only in the 1920s to 1960s, it was so crucial that people like Solzhenitsyn were being exiled for writing stories, for writing fiction. And there seemed to be a discrepancy between totalitarian regimes that burned books, that censored books, and exiled people for reading certain or writing certain books. And then our current culture, which act like books don't matter. I mean, Walker Percy said something along the lines of, I envy Solzhenitsyn because he could write something and people took it seriously and thought the stories would shape you in such a way that it could be revolutionary. And so I started reading a lot of the stories that came out of not just, the Nazi era and the oppression that was going on in Europe during that time, but also what was happening during the Soviet takeover of Russia and the different writers that were dissidents during that time period. And then I started looking at the camps or the prisons, even in the Dominican Republic in Alvarez's tale, where they were in prison and holding on to literature, writing poetry, memorizing verses. And that was actually giving their life meaning even within those confinements. So there seemed to be some sort of power that those of us in the oversatisfied American world were missing out on.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that poetry, literature was so important during totalitarian period? And we who have such opportunities for it, we kind of want to be entertained.
It's challenging, right? Well, So I look at Dostoevsky wrote The Grand Inquisitor, and in that story, the way that the Grand Inquisitor keeps his power, he implements a system very similar to the Roman Empire, bread and circuses, right? He feeds people and entertains them. And if he can feed and entertain them, they'll never notice the deeper substance that they're missing, and they'll never long for something more. And so most dystopian fiction follows that same kind of feel, that the people are kept safe by not being free, but by believing that they're happy when they're not. So I hesitate to say this, but I'm worried that that's the case where we are, is that we are just so happy with our material things, so happy with our entertainment. We've never questioned whether there's a deeper happiness here that we're experiencing or not.
Yeah. There's that famous beginning of Amusing Ourselves to Death by Postman, where he says, we kind of feared that there was going to be Orwell, but instead we got A Brave New World. Huxley's A Brave New World, that we've been amused. Now, I think I might have talked about this in the podcast. I think actually it's both of them. I think that two things are happening. And I think that's actually the dystopian mix, right? It's I was talking to a writer who writes the novelist, is Michael O'Brien, who writes a number of things, including like apocalyptic novels. Mm-hmm. And he said once, what you're trying to do is highlight, really focus in on one aspect. Mm-hmm. And so Orwell's focusing in on one aspect. Huxley's focusing on another aspect. But I think it's interesting that you use this Dostoevsky Grand Inquisitor, that really totalitarianism is the mix of hard and soft, mm-hmm. right? All hard, all soft maybe doesn't work. But I think let's start with, we can go weave back and forth and you can talk about whatever book you want. But I think those themes are really clear in Fahrenheit 451.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
More so than in, say, The Time of Butterflies, where there's less kind of the entertainment element. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit harder, and threats. There's distraction taking place, but it's more, how would I say, it's more of a propaganda mm-hmm. in the Dominican Republic novel. And we'll talk about what that, the story, you can maybe outline it for the listeners, but it's more of a propaganda that you then awaken to.
Right.
Whereas in 451, and I would say related to today, we're experiencing a mix of propaganda and entertainment.
Yes.
And so in Fahrenheit 451, right, you've got the burning of the books. And that, I think, is what we focus on, right? There's somebody going to burn the books. But there's also the constant entertainment, the television, the AirPods, right? Mm-hmm. The seashell AirPods, the family, what they call the people who are on television, who are more real to you than the people you live with, right? This being online, there's one point where he almost predicts, right? Because this was written in 1953. Mm-hmm. And he's predicting people are going to be online for more hours a day than they're actually engaged with people. So this Fahrenheit 451, it's very prophetic in a sense, but we focus on the burning of the books, but sometimes maybe we miss the propaganda entertainment side. Do you think that's right? Or what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. So real quick on Michael O'Brien, I did want to make sure I plug his book on the family and the new totalitarianism. And so Wise Blood Books just republished that. And I wrote the intro to that because I read that essay and thought, this is haunting that Michael O'Brien is putting his finger on this new totalitarianism that we're seeing. And Rod Dreher calls it, the soft totalitarianism and identifies it with a certain political side. But I don't know that that's 100% accurate. I just think that it is true that we are seeing a soft totalitarianism in the way that people are being lured into just living for entertainment and pleasure. And it makes them not likely to give up those pleasantries for a cause, right? They don't really want to give up their convenience. And in Fahrenheit 451, I think the most haunting image is that Montag, who's the main character, his wife surrounds herself with her people. And it's just walls of media. It's like every wall is a screen. And this is 1953. So he is being prophetic here. But every wall is a screen and she talks to them and she lives with them. And in a sense, she becomes formed by these non-realistic, these virtual personalities. And we've seen that in our current culture where people are watching television and they get to know the characters who are not real people. And that becomes their relationships, which are really one-sided and only for the purpose of entertainment. If I could just read one passage from Fahrenheit 451, where I think you get this sense. It's the fire marshal who's saying this to Montag, who works for the fire department. And in their context, fire department means someone who actually burns books, not someone who stops fires. So the fire marshal says, if you don't want a person unhappy politically, give him two sides to a question to worry him. Don't give him two sides. Sorry, give him one. Or better yet, give him none. Let him forget there is such a thing as war. If government is inefficient, top-heavy, tax-mad, better it be all those than that people worry over it. Peace. Give the people contests they win by remembering words to popular songs or the names of state capitals or how much corn in Iowa grew last year. Cram them full of non-combustible data and chock them so damn full of facts they feel stuffed but brilliant with information. Then they'll feel they're thinking. They'll get a sense of motion without moving, and they think they'll be happy. Whoa.
Right now. I mean, this book it's incredible when you look at it even in the context of today. I mean, I think there's an interesting point just on the first part of the wife, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's got these basically AirPods in her ears, okay? And Montag is feeling terrible because he's just burned books, but also the woman burned with them, right? And so he's sick. And so he says, will you turn the parlor off, which is the screens? That's my family. That's her answer. Like, so to her husband, that's my family. Will you turn it off for a sick man? Well, I'll turn it down, okay? But she did nothing to it. And he said, is that better? Thanks. It's my favorite program. And so they're having this conversation. And then as they talk about this element, like, he's like, are you going to ask me about what happened last night? She's completely uninterested in what happened. And then he talks about, like, I've burned this woman and all these books. And she's completely like an arm of the state, right? Mm-hmm. Repeating, oh, well, she deserves it, right? She should have thought of that beforehand. There's no empathy, nothing. And so it's very interesting because just in that connection, we have this question, which I want to talk about this maybe in more detail, but just at least to bring it up now. You know, one of the things that's so profound about totalitarianism and literature and totalitarianism, and people talk about this all the time, is how is it possible that everybody starts to cooperate? Mm-hmm. And I think Bradbury in 451 is making it clear, like, entertainment prepares us to easily cooperate, mm-hmm. which is, you don't really think. You think it's going to be the pressure that comes. And that was your point. I think this is an interesting one. You know, we are so acclimated to our convenience that it's going to be hard to give it up. And I see it in, like, myself. I see it in my children. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do anything hard. You know, it's just like, come on, why is it taking so long for this page to load? Right. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, even if you like slowed down our internet, you could, you know, we might just cave in. Right.
Or, I mean, cell phones, Michael, it's, you know, I know that the cell phone is reading my conversation, right? I know that it's going to deliver certain ads to me based on the conversations that I'm having around it. I know that. I've seen that. And I go back and forth on a regular basis. Do I just get a flip phone? But the convenience, and then it's the convenience. But at the same time, it's causing me to be more time on it than I need to. So do I give that up so I can still have my life and still be a person? And, you know, I've taken off my social media apps. If that helps, great. If not, I might have to go the whole hog and just like get rid of the phone because I don't want to become cattle. I don't want to become a sheep in a system. Like, I want to make sure that I still have my freedom and I'm not lured into a false sense of happiness in which I've given up my freedom to a cell phone.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I have the exact same questions, you know, and then I got rid of my Twitter app. Okay. And then I just look it up on the Safari. It's the same thing. It's exactly, I couldn't win. So I'm going to do two parts of self-promotion here. So I did an interview with Jaron Lanier on this podcast. So if you haven't heard that, listeners, where I actually talked to him, he wrote a book called 10 Reasons to Delete Your Social Media Accounts Right Away. And then I also wrote a little booklet, a little monograph. It's pretty short. It's called Digital Pandemic. Mm-hmm. So you can get that as well. And that actually, I go through like 8 steps to, in a sense, first of all, just kind of protect ourselves from surveillance capitalism, behavior modification, and just intrusion of data. And that's the thing that like Lanier and others point out, is that you're not simply using the phone. It's analyzing you and then engaging in behavior modification. Mm-hmm. But I think you're exactly right. And I think this is another area where Bradbury is just so prophetic. So I want to go from the entertainment to the books thing, and we can come back to other elements. But one of the things that strikes me, I wish I could find the quote page. I'm not going to remember the exact quote. So when I find it, I'll put it up on the podcast notes for this at themoralimagination.com. But there's this element of reading, and I think you started to touch upon it, that Montag does as well. So reading is very important, but there are many well-read, highly literary people who've read all the classics and all the great books, and right. But if you look at how they actually think, they think, for example, today, they think exactly aligned with whatever the, New York Times editorial page, whatever is kind of fashionable. I mean, that's just like a symbol of fashion, that you can't really tell them apart from anyone of their time. So there's this line Chesterton has where he says, "The church is the one thing that saves you from the embarrassing situation of being a child of your time." And in one way, that's what reading is supposed to do as well. It's supposed to bring you out of it. And Bradbury kind of deals with this a little bit. There's a tension. Everybody is like, we're going to keep books and we're not going to burn books and we're going to protect books. But in almost every other aspect of their life, they've completely been, in a sense, behavior modified to be just 2021 absolute modern vision of the world. All that reading has seemed never to touch. And that seems to be, maybe it's provocative, but that seems to be one of the things that also Bradbury's getting to. It's not enough simply to read. Do you think that's wrong? What do you think?
I think there's what you read and how you read. Those two have a lot to do with it. But I do think that reading is one of the keys. Bradbury concludes with the idea that reading is one of the keys and the ways out. And one of the things you get from Montag that's different than his wife is that he actually is reading. He is stealing these books from people's homes, and it's changing the way that he sees the world so that he doesn't just go along with the system. He doesn't spend all of his day in front of the screens like his wife does. So I do think that reading is part of what can be a resource for a free mind. I also think that how you read very much matters. If you're reading to be shaped by a text and not to use a text, then it is going to shape you and transform you. I think it's going to challenge you out of the present, what you were talking about being a child of your time. I think it's going to challenge you away from complacency. But if you are reading just to use it, you're going to discard anything that doesn't fit the way you want to see the world. And that method of reading in which you're still a consumer and you're still seeing things with utilitarian lens, you're going to go along with your culture and you're just going to take whatever quotes from the text fit your culture or not. And I think that becomes very problematic. So it's what you read and how you read, I think, that can be those resources for transformation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then it also has to do with like the content of what you're reading. So I'm thinking on page 78 of this edition, which is the 60th anniversary edition, Montag is talking to Faber, right? Who's the librarian, literature professor, book collector, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting that his name is Faber, right? So he's the maker and Montag is the burner, the destroyer. Mm-hmm. And throughout, Bradbury has this sense that destruction's easy and creation is really hard. Mm-hmm. But then at one point, Montag is talking about how the only thing I positively knew was gone with the books that I'd burned in 10 or 12 years. So I thought books might help. And then Faber, who's this proponent of reading, says, "You're a hopeless romantic. It would be funny if it were not so serious. It's not books that you need. It's some of the things that once were in books. The same things could be in parlor families today. Mm-hmm. The same infinite detail and awareness could be projected through the radios and the televisions, but are not. No, it's not books at all you're looking for. Take it where you can find it, in old phonograph records, in motion pictures, in old friends. Look for it in nature and look for it in yourself. Books were only one type of receptacle where we stored a lot of things we were afraid we might forget. There's nothing magical in them at all. The magic is only in what the books say, how they stitched the patches of the universe together into one garment for us. You couldn't know this. Of course, you still can't understand what I mean by when I say this. You are intuitively right. That's what counts. 3 things are missing. And then he goes through quality, leisure, as opposed to being in off hours. And 3, the right to carry out actions based on what we learn from the interaction of the first 2. Okay. So the quality, the leisure, and the right to carry out actions based on what we learn from the interaction of the first 2.
Yeah, I think classically educated people would say quality, meaning there's goodness, truth, or beauty there, right? There's some transcendent good or morality there. There's some transcendent truth, eternal verity. And there's some beauty. There's something that evokes a sense of the human soul and the sublime and moves you that direction. So that's quality. And then leisure would be the space to contemplate it, right? And we definitely do not have the sense that contemplation would be worthwhile. And even recently, I posted on Twitter something about contemplation because I've been writing a lot about the relationship between contemplation and action, which is what Faber's getting at here. And so many people pushed back. Contemplation is a waste of time. Contemplation, keeps you from caring for the poor, and contemplation keeps you from being active in your community. And contemplation, you're not going to be out there protesting Black Lives Matter if you're contemplating. And I thought you're misunderstanding.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
Contemplation feeds action. It actually shows you right action so that you can see the kind of action that's needed rather than acting and constantly just doing without a sense of for what purpose or where's the meaning in what you're doing. And then when you act and you actually participate, as Faber was talking about, the freedom to get to act, then that leads you back to contemplation. So there's this reciprocal relationship that used to be there, and the quality would be what it is that you're contemplating, right? Or focused on.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, a couple of things stand out. One is that's why, just reading it without allowing it to shape you, you're just like a sophisticated intellectual, but you're still a man of your time, right? Or a woman of your time. I think that's an interesting thing. And then on the contemplation, that surprised me. I would think people would say, oh yeah, good, contemplation is good. So it's interesting, this rejection of contemplation. There's a lot we probably could talk about, but this is a whole idea, a modern idea, influenced a lot with Marxian ideas of the idea of praxis, that we must be doing constantly. Doing is what matters, and that being is, in a sense, relegated. There's many themes from one of my favorite philosophers, Josef Pieper, where he has a book, of course, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, and then In Tune with the World. But there's a wonderful quote from Pieper that I found where he says this. This is a quote. Fundamental truths must be pondered anew, lest they lose their fruitfulness. Okay? In this lies the significance of meditation, that truth may not cease to be present and effective in the active life. End quote. So I think that's like a Pieper kind of summary of the point you made, right? That if you're not meditating on and pondering the fundamental truths, what happens, they lose their fruitfulness, and then they cease to be present and effective in the active life. And so that tension on that is very interesting. Anyway, I have a couple of questions, but why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm stealing it all from Pieper. That's who I was talking about and drawing this from, right? The ideas of contemplation and only the lover sings and what is tradition. This is all coming from Pieper. But also this idea of the traditions, the way he talks about the living out of these truths. And that's where you get the saints in the church. That's where you get these ideas of tradition that you have to actually embody the text for them to matter or to be worthwhile. Louise Cowan said, the only reason great books are ever great is because somebody continues to live them and read them. But if you're not living and reading them, they're just dead things that, like Faber said, it's not the books themselves, it's how they're lived out that matters.
Yeah, that's good. So let's circle back a little bit to, at one point I think it's on page 70 or so, he actually uses the cave. You can escape the cave if you're reading, right? And so there's this tension between reading serious things, remembering, writing them down. And there's almost like a Solzhenitsyn element too, right? Because you have to remember them and then write them down, just like he was doing in the gulags. What else, what stands out to you that I think that's relevant? Like when you read Bradbury, again, I'm kind of pushing this because we often think of burning of the books as the problem. But the quote from Bradbury says, it doesn't matter if you burn books. It matters if people read them or not. Right? I think that's a paraphrase, obviously.
Right.
But what else stands out to you think that's really important for us to pay attention to in his warnings about entertainment?
Well, also with the book burning, I used to tell my students that, basically paraphrasing Bradbury, it's heinous that the Nazis burned books, but I think it's worse what we do now. We convince people that books are not worth our time, right? That they don't need to read them and that that's not a good use of your time. Instead, you should use it being on your phone for as long as possible. For me, it's less now about entertainment and more about distraction. People are being purposefully distracted from living. And that's where I'm seeing more problems, especially, in my classroom and with students, than even entertainment. They're watching things that cannot be entertaining, right? People opening boxes on YouTube. Like, even saying it out loud, like, that can't be entertaining to people. But it's pulling on just your distracted nature, your nature to be distracted and not have to think about things that are hard or troubling or difficult. And therefore you become so sensitive, like almost raw to the world, and the slightest things will hurt you, let alone the things that could make you stronger.
That's interesting. So maybe just develop that a little bit more. That, like, the entertainment part is one part, but I think the distraction, in a sense, there's proper distractions of living your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going to work, taking care of your family, doing the dishes, right? There's that wonderful C.S. Lewis, How to Live in a Time of the Atomic Age, right? Well, we should be caught the end of time just doing the things that are part of life. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, there's a positive sense of kind of being engaged. But there's something else with distraction. I think there's this kind of tension. You see this in the Time of the Butterflies too. Like, you can be too preoccupied with your little self that you miss the bigger. But distraction, I think, is something that we don't maybe pay attention to sufficiently. Can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's treating yourself as though you're not a human being, you're not an embodied soul. And just what you were saying with the phones and being programmed for behavior modification, it can only behavior modify you if you have lowered yourself into just your behaviors and not into something deeper and richer than that. I think it's Alan Jacobs in Breaking Bread with the Dead who talks about us having these thin, flimsy souls that can kind of just be tossed by the wind, versus the developing thick souls that can't be distracted and can't be turned towards every whim of the wind, right? With culture. And instead, they're so thick and substantial, it's hard to move them. And that's what we need. Human beings are meant to be that. We are very capable of being thick, and yet we're allowing ourselves to be thinned down to almost nothingness.
What do you think makes us thick?
This is where I would find books come into play, but also, like Faber was saying, the right kind of music, the study of science, the study of math. I mean, we turned math into nothing but application, and therefore completely robbed it of any meaning whatsoever. I was taught math in school only towards its utility. And everybody asked, what am I ever going to use this for? And that was not the point. The point wasn't the usefulness or not of a subject. And it never should be the usefulness or not of a subject. Math can be about learning to read the nature of the world, seeing the Fibonacci sequence in everything. It can be about discovering a new way of seeing that opens you up and deepens you. And we've missed that. We don't understand our very purpose is in learning how to see better, that there's always more and more to see. And when we do that, that's what actually thickens us and gives us layers, is this developing an expansion of vision that actually provides a thickness in which, I will stand up for myself as an embodied soul and will not allow you to distract me into your service.
Yeah, no, I think it's difficult. And I also think that, so reading is a part of it. I think, as you said, all music and the arts. And I think, again, both of us are influenced by Pieper. We didn't know that we both were Pieper fans here. Yeah. But, there's this sense, this is Pieper, other people like von Hildebrand, that joy cannot be grasped. Joy is the fruit of a love relationship. Mm-hmm. That it requires actual, willing the good of others, self-sacrifice, suffering. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can talk a little bit about Solzhenitsyn. I mean, we don't want suffering. And again, I quoted Lewis before. Lewis writes about suffering. And I think one of that's so helpful when you read Lewis is that he lets you know how much he doesn't want any suffering at all. Mm-hmm. And so you can I'm with you, mm-hmm. right? When you read people like Solzhenitsyn, it's like almost too much. It's like overwhelming. Or you read, say, some of the saints and mm-hmm. the intense suffering they went through voluntarily, even for the gospel, and you think, okay, I can't do that. But I think that too is what distraction undermines.
Right. Right. Absolutely. You become unwilling to suffer for anything. And if we are only making decisions based on convenience, it means many times we're going to make the wrong decision, because most difficult things are going to cause us suffering. I was on a panel one time with Eleanor Stump, who wrote the book on suffering, Wandering in the Darkness. And everyone was talking to her about, how can you believe in a good God with suffering in the world and all those basic questions. And she just kind of shut the whole panel down by saying, name a hero who went through life without suffering. There is no one that any of us respect or admire that went through an easy, distracted, entertaining existence. No one. And I think that's what we miss in our culture. We want heroes, we want saints, we want superheroes, but none of their stories are without suffering. So why is it that we do everything we possibly can in our lives to not only go away from suffering, but to go away from inconvenience at all? That doesn't make any sense for what it is that we're actually wanting.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I would like you to maybe just talk a little bit, because you're a Solzhenitsyn scholar, a little bit about Solzhenitsyn on suffering.
Sure.
But, I would also maybe just slightly from a different angle. So I'm going to bracket that for just a second. I think what we are seeing, however, is there is a desire for what we'll call kind of secular self-suffering. That is, I think people are trying to start to want to do hard physical things. And that's, I think, perhaps a good sign. But I also wonder, you've got extreme sports, and the extreme sports, the difficult elements, they're not actually morally strong. They're kind of a substitute for heroic virtue. So let me try to articulate this and feel free to disagree with me. I do think by making physical, denying yourself, and this is the whole purpose of fasting, right? By denying yourself, you can actually reduce your attachment to convenience, and you can, in fact, grow in virtue. But I also wonder if, there's a certain kind of stoic movement or this kind of deprivation elements, but morally, it's almost like it makes you more selfish, right? As opposed to maybe some, guy or lady who's not super fit and maybe has too many sweets, but they're really living for other people in heroic suffering that's interior. And I sometimes wonder, I think you're right, there's this desire, we want convenience, but then we want suffering on our own terms as well. You see this on Twitter, for example. We're both on Twitter. You see it on Twitter, I follow different people, and there's this almost macho, I'm going to be awesome. But yes, but you're you can almost tell in the rest of your writing and your posts that you're totally self-centered, right? So whereas what you're getting from the heroes that you mentioned, and Solzhenitsyn, you can go to that, is that suffering requires this self-donation to others and for a higher cause. I think there's two things. There's convenience, and there's we're going to create new kinds of suffering, but that don't really push us.
Yeah. Or suffering for self-improvement, suffering through a workout so that you can be stronger.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that's different from the heroic thing you're talking about, it seems like. Maybe you could develop it or critique it.
Right. Well, now I can't remember who it was that said this, but something that I read in which they were talking about Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King Jr. purposefully put themselves in the way of suffering, but not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they wanted to help other people. And so their lives were this constant asceticism, but the whole goal was a grander vision that was bigger than themselves that they were aiming at. And I would say Solzhenitsyn was the same. I mean, he had just been released from prison, and it gave him a greater vision of what his life was for. When you read the introduction or the dedication of the Gulag Archipelago, he basically says, I'm writing this book for all those stories of those who did not get a chance to tell them. And for all the stories that I don't know, please forgive me. I mean, there's this survivor's guilt that compels him to tell these stories for a greater end than his own. And even writing them gets him exiled and causes him greater suffering. But he's willing to undertake that, on the chance and the hope that Russia will be Russia again and not under Soviet rule.
He talks about how like the cell and suffering, being
Mm-hmm.
in prison was his salvation.
Yes, yes, bless you, prison. And the reason he said that in several books. So he says it in the Gulag Archipelago, but he also says it even in Ivan Denisovich at the very end, right? This idea of like, you should be grateful for prison because it gives you the chance to work on your soul. It gives you the time to focus on the things that matter. All the distractions have been taken away. If you identified yourself by your haircut or the music that you like to listen to or the hobbies that you had, and that is who you thought you were, those were all taken away and stripped from you when you entered the prison system. So his identity becomes what is in his soul inside him. And that's who he starts to identify himself as. And that to him becomes a blessing. That really is where freedom comes from. And he realizes that liberation is this internal state that can't be just handed to you. If I could add someone to that, I think of Zora Neale Hurston in Moses, Man in the Mountain. There's this, it's a story of Exodus, like you see in the Bible, but it's a retelling that Hurston makes. And she has Moses lead the Israelites all the way up to Canaan. And then he's looking down on them from the mountain where he's supposed to die. And he's like, I never taught them how to be free inside. I freed them from Egypt and they're just not free. And Solzhenitsyn talks about this too. Liberation must be something that is from the soul and not something about chains or no chains on the outside.
Yeah, and that I think also Victor Frankl talks about that in Man's Search for Meaning, and so many, this like interior freedom. And the thing that I think is powerful in Solzhenitsyn and Frankl and in Alvarez's In the Time of Butterflies is their prison comes up. And
Mm-hmm.
I pray I never go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, it's not in any way romanticized. I mean, it's horrible, right? It's completely dehumanizing. But as Frankl and Solzhenitsyn both point out, it was like a lot of people became so dehumanized, they would become traitorous, others would go crazy, others committed suicide. But for some people, it was this blessing for Solzhenitsyn. One of the things that struck me in the book, In the Time of Butterflies, there are many things, was just how prison was such a dehumanizing experience for the ladies. And at the same time, one of the characters, I think it's Mate, she's going, and we'll talk about that, like maybe we'll give a quick outline of the book here in a second, but she's going through this element where she's a political prisoner. And there are other prisoners who are in for like prostitution and stealing and drugs and other kinds of crime. And they're together, but also separate. But she becomes friends with some of them, and they all kind of join together and recognize the humanity in each other. And so that she grows, like my pride was stripped away. I was able to see the sufferings of others. So it's this dehumanizing, but they refuse to let themselves be dehumanized despite even torture. And I thought it's a pretty hard chapter, especially that prison chapter, like her prison diaries. It was really striking about that tension, which you see in Solzhenitsyn and Frankl. Like, it's the most dehumanizing place, and people are deeply harmed. And yet, those who make it through, and not everyone does, they are more human, and the least human people are the guards. I thought that's just like really, it's a kind of a theme throughout. I mean, do you see this? Maybe you could elaborate on that, but I see that in so many different places.
Sure. So in both Ivan Denisovich or any of Solzhenitsyn's works, people talk about them like political novels. And In the Time of the Butterflies has also been talked about as a political novel because you have these four women who are revolting against the dictatorship that's in the Dominican Republic, and eventually they will become martyrs for it. But what I think you have to understand about Solzhenitsyn and Alvarez's vision is those are very religious visions that are offered, not merely political ones. And they do take place when there's political oppression and they are fighting for freedom, for something that's higher and better than what is being offered to them by the government. And so when they're in prison, what they're turning to is not just the formation of poetry and so forth, which they do, even in, so Solzhenitsyn wrote poems that gave meaning to his life. In the Time of the Butterflies, you hear Minerva when she's in solitary confinement, reciting poetry to herself to not go crazy, right? And using poetry as like a mantra for her sanity. I think what you see is even deeper than that, the formation they had from their upbringing. So Solzhenitsyn was raised by his mother in the Orthodox faith, and it comes back to him so that in the conversations in the first circle where he's representing himself almost autobiographically there against another political prisoner, it's his faith that gives him strength more than the political stance of the other characters. And in The Time of the Butterfly, something very similar happens. You have Minerva and Mate in prison, and Minerva's fighting for freedom. And Mate says, I want to come through this being able to love my enemies. Well, those ideas, the way they define freedom and love of enemies, those are their Catholic upbringing that is really shining through, something they thought they had rejected. But in those moments of crisis, that's the thickness of their souls that was able to withstand the torture and the dehumanization.
Yeah, well, that's really good. So in Time of Butterflies, I'll do a pause for a second. So as you pointed out, it's set in the 1950s, early 1960. It's in the dictatorship of Trujillo, and it's based on a true story. It's a novel, but it's based on a true story of these four sisters. And this is, we're not actually giving anything away. It's right in the beginning. These four sisters who are killed. It's kind of their story from their childhood all the way up to their death, and then the one sister all the way up into the 90s, and this reflection back and forth. And she's a really good writer. I was kind of taken. She's a really good writer. And there's you point out there's a deep religious vision in it. And the sisters, as you said, are struggling. I mean, one of them is very religious and then like almost completely loses her faith and then gets it back. And then the others, as you said, with this thickness of soul, they're very human. It humanizes the fact that each of them has difficulties and struggles and trying to figure out what's going on. But especially in the prison and later, this idea, there's a couple things that struck me. One is we have to be able to forgive each other. This is like almost a quote, after we allowed all of this to happen. So there's a sense that, why did this happen? And then we have to forgive each other. That the prison humanitizes, is that the word?
Humanizes.
Humanize. Thank you. I was like, that's not right. Okay. I think I've been using too much hand sanitizer. And so I was like, sanitized, humanitized. Okay. So we humanize them. And this idea also, there's the real overlap when Patria is talking about the secret police guy, Peña, who's a bad guy. Okay. And he says that each of us has an angel and a devil. And there's almost echoes the Solzhenitsyn line of the good and evil running through the human heart. I thought that element, that spiritual element that you bring out, and one other point, and then you can comment on it, is Patria. She has this magnificent spiritual growth where everyone becomes her child. Even Trujillo, the dictator, Peña, everybody is her child. She puts everyone into this position of, she has this deep devotion to the Blessed Mother. Right? Constant. And we'll fight with her, why did you do this to me? What did these happen? And her suffering goes on. And then in her spiritual maturity through her suffering, everyone becomes her mother, that she's willing their good. Super powerful.
Yeah. And there's that scene earlier in the novel in which she thought she's lost her faith because she lost a child. And then she actually turns around in a church and looks behind her and hears, in a sense, the Virgin Mother saying to her, I've always been here. These are your children, right? And to take care of them. And so you're right. I mean, that is the response that they have to the suffering. And rather than, as you were saying earlier, rather than turn inward and, what does this have to do with me? This would threaten my family. I would be at risk if I stood up against Trujillo. I mean, all three of these mothers that end up standing up against him, they do so for their children, even though at the loss of their lives that they don't get to raise their children. Because the idea that their children would be raised in a world where they would be dehumanized would not be worth the convenience of getting to watch their children grow up. And that is just, I cry when I read about their death because I don't know how much strength I would have to give up my time with my kids so that my kids could be more free than I was. And so in that sense, that novel really invites you to see the purpose behind their suffering, to see the purpose behind their sacrifice.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also that they are all just ordinary women. And what's also, I think, interesting about this is they're each different kind of revolutionaries. That is, they're each in a different kind of rebellion. So that's one. And then the second part of the rebellion is sometimes it's immediately aligned with the husband. Sometimes the husband is the leader. Sometimes they bring their husband in to the rebellion. And then how even their marriages are like mostly like strengthened, as it were, by this suffering, how they all kind of join together. And I think that it's interesting on the different kinds of rebellion. So for example, Minerva, right, is this almost standard kind of Marxist revolutionary, right? Marxist revolutionary, liberty, right? And her sisters, one of the sisters is very much a homemaker, doesn't want to get involved, but does later, right? And then the other sister is totally pious, also a homemaker. And her rebellion, again, is connected into the fact that she saw people being killed, innocent boys being killed, which makes her a rebel. And so her rebellion in many ways is like deeper and more profound, even though Minerva has a natural courage and a natural kind of rebellious element. And Patria and Mate have this softness about them, but their rebellion is maternal almost, right? Which is striking. I don't know. What did you think? I mean, I'm reading this as a man, so it's interesting. This is a woman's novel, right? I mean, it's really like all the narrators are the sisters. You know, the men, they're mixed, right? I mean, all the men are, I mentioned to you, Jeremiah says, like in the prophet Jeremiah says, the heart of man is not trustworthy, right? And there's a certain like heroic, absolute commitment, and then they're kind of like, oh, not trustworthy sense. And then the women are very much, in a sense, grounded in reality, in the earth, in their children, but their rebellion is not simply a political revolution. It's like an internal rebellion against dishonesty. Does that make sense? What do you think?
Internal rebellion against dishonesty. I would say it's internal rebellion against dishonesty. I think it is a rebellion against an oppression people weren't noticing. And you said earlier that each of the characters wake up to what's going on, and that becomes why they rebel. At what point do you get mad? I was in church just 2 weeks ago, and my pastor was saying something like, at what point do you just get mad? I mean, at what point do you sound like the psalmist and say, no, like, I'm not going to take this anymore. I know that you're lying to me. I know that I can't trust you. At one point, do you stop choosing convenience over freedom and virtue and justice and all the things you know are higher goods? I think the story allows you to live through each of these sisters' decision as they wake up. I mean, one of them even says that she woke up to what was happening. And then the harder question, now what was she going to do now that she knew what was going on? And so you can either choose to blind yourself to what's happening, or once you see, do you act or not act? I mean, there's always these series of choices. It's not like you wake up and then you have to go and fight the good fight. You have a choice after you wake up to go back into hiding because it's easier or not. And the novel really forces you as a reader to kind of make that choice with the sisters.
Yeah, I think so. I guess that's what I meant. Maybe that internal rebellion against dishonesty, there's an awakening that this is a lie, that Trujillo is not our great leader, but he's bad. And they experience him in his, he's a sexual predator, he's a murderer. And they experience that. And then, as you articulate, it's not like Minerva is already ready. She's kind of naturally inclined. Her personality is like, let's rebel. The others are much more homemakers, but they realize, as you pointed out, their duty to rebel for their children and for that they were propagandized in a sense, right? What they've been around is untrue. Right. And now go ahead.
Sorry. And then to not fight is to be complicit. I mean, that's the awareness too that they come to, is to not fight is to be complicit. And Minerva, even her mother chides her sometime, like, you're always going to be fighting everyone else's fight, aren't you, darling? And she's like, everyone else's fight is my fight. I mean, it is my fight. It's not just their fight over there. If they lose their fight, I've lost mine. So there's, it's almost like a mystical body communion of the saints idea that's kind of invested in this novel.
Yeah, I think that's also the tension, is to not resist is to become complicit. And that maybe that's another thing that both Bradbury, Solzhenitsyn, and Alvarez in Time of Butterflies, that, and I would like you to maybe develop, is how did everybody become complicit? And this comes through even in the sisters, right? I quoted one thing where they said, we have to forgive each other after we all allowed this to happen. And that everyone became, in a sense, a part of this. That's another tension, because I've talked about this before on the podcast. Okay. I think if the bad totalitarians came during the Nazi period, I would stand up to them, right? Well, I can't even tell the truth in small situations. I'm like, well, I don't want to cause a problem. I'm not meaning externally lying. It's just like, I'm just going to avoid the problem and mind my own business, right? Why do I think that somehow during the hardest pressure, I would be able to resist? And this novel is almost like in the background, there are all these people who are quiet enough to be left alone. And correct me if you think this is a misread, but that the Mirabal sisters kind of get picked on a little bit. One, because they're beautiful and Trujillo is trying to seduce one of them. And so they have to start to fight. But had they just kind of compromised a little bit, kept their head down, they could have more or less been left alone. And they're put in a situation where they realize, I either fight or I'm complicit. But in the background, everybody's just kind of complicit. Do you think that's right? I think that's why the book is so powerful, because we're kind of in the background. We're like everybody else, and they're the heroes.
Yes, I read this book, Keys to Bonhoeffer's House by Laura Fabricki last year, and she's talking about learning Bonhoeffer's story. And what it made me realize, whether she wrote this explicitly or not, but it made me realize whatever I would have done during Bonhoeffer's time is what I'm doing now. And if I'm not doing anything now, then I wouldn't have done anything different in Bonhoeffer's time. And trying to assess, where is it that you stand up right now? Where is it that, what do you do when you see injustice? What's your response? Right? Is it just like, oh, that's sad that things are like happening like that? Or are you fighting it with your work and with your life and with letters to the Congress, with protest, with Lights for Liberty? I mean, what are you doing? And if you're not doing anything, then you're right. Probably during the time the Nazis took over or the time that Trujillo ruled the Dominican Republic, you would have been quiet. So I think we have to assess what we're currently doing now in light of these stories about what certain heroes did when they were struggling against injustice.
Yeah, I think that's just one of the reasons why they're important. So there's a couple quick things. I know you have to go here. So one is, I just want to point out another thing that kind of struck me a couple times. And I don't know what Alvarez is, how she's addressing it, but it struck me. There's an attraction to Fidel Castro, to Che Guevara. And she doesn't really deal with it. Just comes up a couple times. They hear Fidel Castro speeches, the idea of liberation, Cuba Libre, we're going to free Cuba, then that's going to free the Dominican Republic. And there's a kind of it's not very powerful, but there's a kind of a communist element. And then the mother of the children is like, they don't like communists. But then Minerva's kind of on the communist side. And it's an interesting kind of almost, I don't know what Alvarez was doing, but it struck me, Che's a bad guy. He's a killer. So is Castro. Fidel Castro and Che are killers, right? And, you've got these kids wearing Che Guevara shirts around. I mean, Che was a cold-blooded murderer, right? And what's interesting, though, about this is this kind of attachment, and almost like there's a warning about, we have to be careful in our resistance, because the resistance can actually also be tyrannical and dictatorial. And I don't know what Alvarez is doing in it, but it seems like it's soft enough that, Cuba is not a place you want to live. You don't want to live under Che any more than you want to live under Trujillo. And they're both bad. But that this attraction to the resistance, you have to be very careful. Any comment on that or disagreement?
Sure, absolutely. Well, you have to remember Solzhenitsyn was a communist. So,
Right, absolutely.
So Alvarez is actually just depicting these sisters accurately, that this was, but like you said, they're jumping out of one bad situation into another if they actually move towards communism at that point.
But understandable, right? I mean, like...
Right, yes.
One other thing is I'm pretty strong anti-communist.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to read this because you really had a sympathy. Like, of course they're hearing about Che and Fidel Castro as liberators. And I thought that was like I don't think I've ever had any more sympathy for someone who who was a supporter of Castro or Che than I do reading this book, because you really understand, like, I see why people would do this. And I mean, I lived in Nicaragua for 3 years, and I remember thinking, look, I get why people become, communists, because if you're really poor, the communists are in charge, everything's bad, it's dangerous. Then the liberals get in charge, and they're not as bad as the communists in any way. But when you're poor, there's crony capitalism, you're kind of locked out, you don't really have any opportunities. And so you think, well, like, what does it really matter? Obviously, there's a difference between a police state and a not police state. But I think it becomes, sometimes we wonder, like, why is there a populist attraction? Well, when you're poor and there's injustice for you, you can kind of begin to understand that. And I think she brings that out very nicely. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted, but keep going. You were talking about this, like, attraction to communism.
Right. I think what Alvarez and Solzhenitsyn are doing is showing the reality that you would be attracted to this way of thinking, and that these ways of thinking are not evil. When it becomes the ideology, it is evil, right? The actual, like, communism is evil. It can't be done well. It can't be done right. But what they're trying to show you is this desire for freedom, this desire for equality, and how those good ideas can be morphed into bad ideology. And Solzhenitsyn does this really well too in The First Circle, because he shows his transformation from a communist. So you sympathize with that protagonist. You even get to see from Stalin's perspective, and then you watch why it is that he moved out of it. None of them are going to just villainize one side. These novelists, what they do for you is they help you to understand, so that you don't fall into the traps of ideology. If you don't understand it and you only demonize it, who's to say you're not going to fall into ideological traps because you never understood what it is you were moving towards?
Right. No, I think that's really well said. And I think this is something I talk about pretty often on this podcast, is that we live in an ideological age. And you and I talked about this actually in an interview we did for the Acton Institute, that we live in this ideological age. And the opposite of ideology is not another ideology.
Right.
It's a philosophical mindset where you have reverence before the truth, and that you're asking questions and you're wrestling. You've been writing on this, but where you avoid dehumanizing the other person by turning them into an object, like reducing them to their ideology. And I think that's a struggle. Both you and I would be on the conservative side of the aisle, and conservatives fall into this. I talked to Elizabeth Corey on this podcast about this. We are in an ideological age. And I think what Solzhenitsyn and Alvarez do is they humanize where some of these bad ideas come from, which I think is really important, so that we don't become ideological.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. Well, okay. I know you have to go because your family's home, and listeners can't see this, but I have seen Professor Hooten Wilson telling her children, please, I'm almost done. So, let's wrap up just pretty quickly. One is, what do you think are just the two big takeaways from Bradbury's book, and why everybody should read it? I kind of failed. I realized, I think so many people are familiar with Fahrenheit 451. We didn't really talk about this idea, like what it is. So, but you have this fireman who is now, the fireman's job is not to put out fires, but to burn books and to kind of sanitize the world for this totalitarian regime. And he ends up reading books and freeing himself from all the propaganda and this whole story there. Why do you think Bradbury's book is so important for us today? What were, like, your two big takeaways that you would tell people? I mean, you've taught this a number of times. What do you think?
For me, it's the ending passage where they're leaving the burning down city and everything's in ruins. And I think that's what people are constantly worried about today, is that everything's just going to be in ruins. And yet in the story, what happens is you have one of the homeless characters who really is part of a community of those who read books and rebelled. And that's why they're outside of the city when it starts burning down. And he's like, yeah, it's burning down, and the phoenix will rise up again. And this is the way of the world. I wish we would stop building these funeral pyres and jumping into the middle of them. But as long as human beings keep doing this, at least the phoenix will continue rising. And the second part is how the phoenix rises, what each of these homeless men at the end, as they're like walking down the train tracks, what they share with Montag as he leaves the burning city is that all of them are books. They give not their real names, but they give their identities by saying, I'm Rousseau, I'm Montaigne, I'm Jefferson, I'm Keats.
Ecclesiastes, right?
I'm Ecclesiastes. Yeah. And so they all give their identity by the books that they've memorized and are actually living it forward. And I think that that's something that we are missing in our culture. This idea that in order to know who you are, you first have to read all these other voices, which sounds ironic, but it's a paradoxical truth. To find your voice, you have to listen to lots of other voices.
And I think also just the stress of memory too. I mean, I'm just was reading something on Marshall McLuhan and how in the digital age, we don't have memory.
Right. And memory is the mother of the muses classically, right?
And so this idea of remembering and then repeating. And I think, again, I've quoted C.S. Lewis, but I think it's the silver chair when he sends Jill Pole, I think, is told, is that right? He's who sent, and you got to remember these 4 things and repeat them over and over again.
Right. Yes.
I think about that a lot. Like you have to remember. And this idea of going back to remember and wrestling with humanity and what it means. I think that's right. Like I remember I used to teach undergraduate philosophy. Like, why do we have to read all this stuff? Because you're a philosopher by nature.
Right.
But in order to cultivate that, you need to engage with people who are very good at it and wrestle with these questions. Otherwise, you are absolutely susceptible to just being propagandized. Otherwise, the TV is talking to you.
Well, and I think that that's a way of kind of wrapping up the other 2 novels as well, because Alvarez, the book ends with Day, who's like essentially the sister who didn't get killed because she didn't rebel against Trujillo. She's allowed to live. And she says, what is it the gringos say about those who don't know their history, repeat it?
Yeah.
And she said, when she wonders about what it was all for, she thinks it was, what is it all for? Well, it's so that we have these heroes. It's so that we know what is worth living and dying for. And someone has to be the one who tells the story and keeps passing the story on. And so we have Alvarez actually passing on the story to us. And you have Solzhenitsyn passing on the story so that we don't forget these things and we don't repeat the errors of the past. And so that the Brave New World of Huxley, but also of Ray Bradbury, that those things don't happen in the future. You're talking about these novels that are from the past that are based on real events. And then you also look at Bradbury's, which is dystopic, right? And you should see them all as functioning in the same way, trying to keep us from burning ourselves to the ground.
Yeah. The other thing I think there's a connection to with Bradbury at the end of Time of the Butterflies is she's a little bit worried about all the kind of entertainment that's happening. And she asked, right, the butterflies, that's their code name, the mariposa. Like, is that what the butterflies died for?
Right.
And I thought that was really, it's very subtle, right? But it's this overlap with Bradbury. Like, what's this for? And I think that also is just it's a really profound theme in the book. But I think in Solzhenitsyn, in Joseph Ratzinger, I talk about a lot, in Augusto Del Noce, these 3, and there are more, really understood that the West had lost the deep understanding of what freedom was for.
Exactly.
And I think Alvarez just in this very subtle element where this lady who's gone through incredible suffering and the loss of her family, it's like, wait, you guys, they died for that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Alice Walker even says that in an essay that she wrote in the 70s. What was the civil rights movement for? Was it so that we could each own our ranch style house and have our several acres of land? Like, is that what Martin Luther King Jr. fought for? So I think this question that we constantly return to is, if we are in an age of freedom, like America thinks it is, what are we using our freedom for? Are we using it just to turn it in so that someone can control us again with entertaining devices? Or are we using it for something substantial, like creating and making beautiful things that are worth living?
I think that's right. And so just one little quote, he says, school is shortened, discipline relaxed, philosophies, histories, languages dropped, English and spelling gradually neglected, finally almost completely ignored. Life is immediate, the job counts, pleasure lies about after work. Do I learn anything save pressing buttons, pulling switches, fitting nuts and bolts? And so that all it's for is, and you brought this up earlier, is utility, right? And pleasure. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why literature and totalitarianism, why it's so important to read these things, is because, and I liked how you talked about the Dostoevsky. That's the challenge it's one of the temptations, right, of human beings. I sometimes say, in the Garden of Eden, you've got the desire to be God or the desire to live like an animal. And the desire to like build bricks and make a name for ourselves in the Tower of Babel.
Right.
The technocratic solution to the problems of evil, or the desire for pleasure. And that I think it's Faber who says, I'm not just looking for words, I'm looking for meaning of life. And I think those things come out. And then also even that each of us has the potential to be this dictator like Trujillo who wants power and pleasure, right? And they were all like in this we want power and pleasure. And that the full human life is, in a sense, to have this internal and, when needed, external, because that's when you're able to have the external rebellion, by having the internal rebellion to your desires to be either all powerful and all pleasure seeking. And I think that comes out, really powerfully in these two novels. Mm-hmm. So any last takeaway on Alvarez before we go?
No, I hope that I made people want to read it.
Oh yeah, it's good. I definitely. I mean, it's a series. It's rough at times. Okay,
yeah.
So it's not light reading, but it's good.
Well, I read about it in my next book that's coming out in 2022. In The Scandal of Holiness, I actually write about Alvarez and Solzhenitsyn and Hurston and others about these same ideas. So
great. So let's just end and say, where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter at Hooten Wilson, and I have a website, www.jessicahootenwilson.com.
Okay. And you've got a lot of books that have come out.
I've got 5 books. One's coming out in 2022 spring. And then I have another one. The 6th book will come out with Zondervan in 2023 and a 7th with Brazos in 2023. So there's stuff coming. Just keep watching.
All right. I'll put links to your books at themoralimagination.com.
Great.
Thank you for your time. And I hope we can have you back.
That'd be great. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thanks, Jessica.